This is at Mostly Linux on Mostly Gaming, episode 0.19 for Sunday, August 5th, 2018. Let's roll. Thank you for joining us here on episode 0.19. This is at Mostly Linux on Mostly Gaming, and we are very happy to have you here for our 19th perpetually beta episode. You know what? Our numbers have been going very, very well in terms of our weekly downloads, so I expect that we have quite a few new listeners this week. Thank you very much for discovering us, for subscribing, and for joining us on Sundays where we launch new episodes and talk about whatever may be of interest to us in that particular week. This week we have a lot of news, and it's been kind of a slow summer, particularly as you kind of get into the E3 component, which is believe it or not a couple of months ago now, and the news flow typically drops down, but now we're starting to get things picking up, and it certainly makes putting together podcasts much easier when we have new things to talk about. This week's distribution is Linux Mint Debian edition, version 3. It's a beta, codenamed Cindy, and I've got it running here in a virtual box. It's actually, I'm running it on KVM, which is a virtual machine manager that is available. You can check it out on your distribution of choice. It's just the three letters KVM. It works very well. I like using it. There's certainly others, and there's pros and cons to each one, but many of you are aware of Linux Mint. It's one of the most popular distributions out there. And standard Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu. Of course, Ubuntu itself is based on Debian. And this version, called LMDE, or Linux Mint Debian edition, is the same Linux Mint that you may be using on your desktop right now, the Ubuntu flavor, but this one skips Ubuntu and instead runs directly off of Debian. Now, why would they want to do that, you might ask? Well, there's a number of benefits to running Debian rather than Ubuntu. For one, Debian typically is less resource intensive than Ubuntu. So for machines that are a little less powerful, this might give you a bit of a performance boost on the same Linux Mint that you're used to. Debian is also typically considered to be more secure in terms of its package management and so forth. It's a little more conservative than Ubuntu tends to be. So if stability is a key, security and so forth are important to you, principally important, then this might be of interest as well. Looking at this article here by Brian Fagioli of Beta News, he states that unlike the traditional Linux Mint operating system, which is based on Ubuntu, LMD is based on Debian. It's based on LMDE 3 beta is based on Debian Stretch, which is kind of the more risky version. There's Debian Stable, which is the highly stable version. Stretch would be kind of think of it, it's got some beta packages in there, so it might offset some of the stability that is inherent in Debian with the fact that they're using a somewhat more leading edge repository for it. The interesting thing here is that it says, apparently while this Debian version of Mint is perfectly usable as a daily driver, its real focus is a contingency plan in case development of Ubuntu ever ceases in the future, which, I find kind of odd. I guess Canonical is the main force behind Ubuntu, and presumably they could decide to stop supporting it. I don't see that as likely. I would see it equally likely that Microsoft would stop supporting Windows 10 or Windows in general. Yes, Ubuntu and Canonical are kind of focusing increasingly on Internet of Things and servers and so forth, and less on desktops, but I don't see that as being a significant risk. I think the real, the main benefits of using Linux Mint Debian is the stability and the security that you get. I personally prefer Debian to Ubuntu generally, but to be clear, for gaming, you're better off with Ubuntu or Linux Mint based on Ubuntu rather than Debian. Games are target Ubuntu rather than Debian. Though you know what, maybe I could be wrong on that. SteamOS itself is based on Debian, so this may be a perfectly acceptable alternative to the Ubuntu flavor of Linux Mint for gaming. In fact, as I kind of think out loud here, I'm going to say the fact that SteamOS is based on Debian, just like Linux Mint, probably would make this an acceptable gaming machine. The other points here with respect to the Debian edition is that there are no point releases in LMDE. So other than bug fixes and security fixes, Debian base packages stay the same. And Mint effectively updates the components continuously. It's not a fully rolling release, but it is far, let's say, semi-rolling. The packages are released on a semi-rolling basis on Linux Mint, as opposed to the point releases on Ubuntu, where you go from 18.4 to 18.1 for the main package updates. Debian edition of Linux Mint does not have point releases, so they will basically release them as they come out. If you want to download LMDE 3 beta, it's available on, just do a search for LMDE, you'll find it there. This is a pre-release, it is a beta. So I wouldn't necessarily drop your current operating system for this until it's fully released. I have installed it, as I said, on a virtual machine. So let's kind of take a look at it right now. I'm running this at 1080p. My regular desktop is at 4K. I don't want to overly tax the system. This is a brand new install. You can see it on the screen here if you're watching the stream. It looks very much like Linux Mint. I'm not an experienced Linux Mint user, but to my unknowledged eyes, let's say, this looks identical to me. I've got this running in 4 gigabytes with 4 cores, so it should provide us with reasonably good performance. And if we take a look here, again, it looks, for all intents and purposes, the same. You do have some slight variations with respect to the way that the system manages updates, the repositories from which packages are downloaded, and the update manager. This is a little more careful, let's say, in how it deals with kernel and driver updates as well. But beyond that, it is a fully functional, good-looking, very stable version of Linux Mint. If I was to choose one versus the other, I would probably, my preference is to not use Debian, not to use Ubuntu. So I would probably go with this if I wanted to go with the Linux Mint variant. You know, alternatively, you can use the Cinnamon desktop environment in your Arch or even your your whatever distribution of choice. You can find and download the Cinnamon desktop environment if that's what you need. Linux Mint Debian also comes in non-cinnamon flavors as well. So really the main benefit here of both the Mint component is access to the Mint specific applications, the Mint specific management and curation, combined with the stability of Debian. And you know, I like this. I haven't spent a lot of time. I did load this up earlier and gave it a run. I didn't provide as much in the way of system resources, so it was a little glitchy. I've given it more room here so that it would, you know, it would run well, and it is running very well. Let's take a look and see what repositories are standard in it. So it has the Linux Mint packages, the Debian packages, the stretch as it says here, and that's basically what you get. You can activate the unstable packages and then run an update if you want to, you know, be more on the bleeding edge. Yeah, but you know, this is what it is. It is a nice, tight Debian flavor of Linux Mint. It runs quickly and well and stable. And if you want to run Linux Mint, but don't want to run Ubuntu, this is probably the distribution for you. You know what? Again, I'm running it here on 4 gigs of RAM with 4 virtual cores. Runs very smoothly. So that is that. So congratulations to the Linux Mint team. We will give this another run when they move from the beta to the full 3.0 release. But let's turn that off right now so that we can free our cores to run our own system here. We've got OBS running. We've got a whole bunch of stuff going on. And you know what? I gotta give it to Intergos here too. It was just kind of chugging along just well on its 4 streams and 8 gigs. I've got a 16 gig system here, so I had lots of room left over to run the rest of my system as that was running LMDE. Our featured non-sponsored stream of the day today is Open Morrowind. This is OpenMW. I'm running a stream from a fellow named Old School RPG, Open Morrowind playthrough, Orcish Tenacity Part 1. He's got a full walkthrough of Morrowind with, let's take a look and see what the package is. He's running it with Tamriel Rebuilt and Morrowind Rebirth in terms of his mods, and I have to say it looks very good. Let's just kind of make it full screen here and take a good look at it.
Is I, Nels Lilando. Oh really? You have not heard of me. I'm not surprised. No, do not tremble in fear. Nels Lilando is a reasonable reasonable man.
I mean, this
hardly
is
hardly the cutthroat someone may come out to be. I fear a headley proposition. It's very simple.
This is an older game, 2002, I believe. So it is a 16-year-old game that is still my favorite Elder Scrolls release. It, you know what? projects like Open Morrowind are just, you know, what make PC gaming so fantastic. For those of you that are not aware, Open Morrowind is a project that effectively looks to supplement or perhaps enhance the base game through an open source engine. 0.44 was released maybe last week with a number of bug fixes and features that you can see here on the screen if you're looking at the video. And you know what? It is coming together. It is still on a beta release, 0.44. But boy, are they ever making a lot of progress on it. It runs if you you know, if your technology supports it, you can run this at 4K right there on your Linux system. You do need the actual game. It uses the data files, and also it is the property of Bethesda. But effectively, it replaces the game engine with this open source engine, making it playable on Windows and of course on Linux as well. It supports all of the mods as well. So if you want to add the mods that this fellow here has, in particular Tamriel Rebuilt, which is I think a must add. Morrowind Rebirth is key as well. Recently there was a new update that added the Khajiit to Nexus mods along with Old Ebonheart, which adds brand new areas to the quest lines and new story content. So you can effectively download a whole bunch of these mods, install them up, add in some graphics and other enhancement mods, use OpenMW. It won't quite be a modern game, but it will it'll look pretty good for what it is. So that's our featured non-sponsored video of the week. We'll keep that running up at the top right of the screen there for those with a lazy eye, and we'll see how that comes together a little later on. So us, you know, our small talk for this week, why don't we basically leave it there and come back in 10 seconds with the news. And we're back. We've got news. Let's start off with this story right here. Steam is hitting its biggest user decline in years. This is a story that came out of PC Games End, but it was covered extensively on many sites, and the story really is that first of all, the story is misleading. Okay, Steam is not facing any decline in users. It is actually the opposite. It is significantly higher, you know, as of the end of June 2018 than it was at the end of June 2017. So these headlines about the biggest user decline, which were you know, common throughout all of the news sites. That's the headline everybody went, like the clickish, baitish headline, which when you read through the article, you realize it's just not true. That is not true. It is actually up. Let's make that clear. Steam is up year over year. So what does this mean? Why are people talking about a big user decline? Well, let's just read this article because the first two paragraphs are kind of, you know, silly and again, just bad journalism in my opinion. So here's paragraph 1. Steam numbers are on a downward trend, and it's a much bigger decline than we've seen in the past. What's to blame? As with a lot of industry trends at this point, you can probably point to Battle Royale as one major contributor, though that may not be the full story. That's paragraph 1. Now here's paragraph 2. To be clear, Steam isn't hurting for players, and numbers are up overall from a year ago. The first Sunday in June last year peaked with 14 million users logged into Steam, while the same peak this year brought 16 million users. Okay, so what the hell are you talking about? Okay. Okay, so that's, again, it doesn't make any sense. Okay, so they're trying to basically create a headline. The users are up by 2 million, by this guy's own story, year over year. So what is it exactly that is happening? And what is happening is that when there is a seasonal flow to Steam's users. And so when we take a look at the seasonality, as Ars Technica has done here, we see that, and for those on video, you can see the chart. For those that are listening to the audio podcast, I'll just describe it. We'll see that there is a flow to it, as I mentioned. So it begins with peak viewership in January. It tends to peak in January, and then it declines for February and March, stabilizes out by April and May, and then it looks like in 2017 it started increasing June and July, August, and then the months of September, October, November, and December are the highest months. So that's the flow, and we see this trend in 2016 as well, and we see this trend in a little different form in 2015 as well. But basically, kind of think of January declining to the summer, picking up late summer, and then peaking in December. So what is happening here is that this big decline that they are talking about is from the peak in January, relative to, let's say, the peak in January of last year, to the July numbers. The decline between January and July is larger than it was between January and July of 2017. And you can see in July of 2017 that July was actually up over June, whereas in 2018, July was down over June. In fact, July has been the weakest month of the year for Steam. So when we take a look at 2016, for example, we see that July was weaker than June, but not significantly lower than January. That's kind of the the trend that we see. January is higher, and they're measuring the decline from January to July. And July was unusually weak this year for whatever reason, relative to the rest of the months, not relative to where it was in the previous year. So as I said, in July was the weakest month year to date for 2018, whereas for 2017, it looks like the weakest months were April and May, with June and July being quite a bit higher. And likewise in 2016, we do see July being a little weaker in 2016, but really not that far off 2015. And so that's the trend. So there's a couple of points here. First of all, it looks like July relative to June had a bigger decline in 2018 relative to 2017 or 16 or 15. So that is an interesting point. It's 1 month, and it could be any one of a number of reasons. July was also unusually hot. It could be any one of a number of outside reasons beyond, Steam is dying. Secondly, there is some possibility that, and we've talked about this before on this podcast, that there are increasingly more and more alternative game launchers out there, including Epic, including the most popular game probably in the world right now, which is Fortnite, which is not a Steam game. So to the extent that a lot of players are moving from let's say PUBG over to Fortnite, or they're just playing Fortnite and not running Steam, you would see a decrease year over year, January to July, relative to January to July of 2017, let's say, because we saw the growth and the peak of PUBG really beginning in the summer of last year and growing up to December. I would say last holiday season it was all about PUBG. So to the extent that Fortnite has really grown since then, you're going to see that reflected in the numbers. Fortnite has affected numbers for every franchise in the world. That's how popular it is. It is affecting Overwatch. It is affecting League of Legends. It is affecting Call of Duty. It is affecting everything. And until that normalizes out, that's going to be the case. Having said that, there is a usage dip in 2018. I believe that the headlines talking about, in fact, even the Ars Technica one, which shows the data, their headline is Steam sees surprising significant usage dip in 2018. Okay, that is a little more accurate because it mentions the year. To be clear, Steam is growing and continues to grow. I'm not an apologist or a supporter of Steam. I'll play wherever whoever is providing the best value. I particularly like Valve because they support Linux. But most people these days basically skim headlines, and those headlines, like for example this one, Steam is hitting its biggest user count decline in years, is just plain wrong. So that's that story. Clickbait is such a problem these days in reporting, because you want to get people to basically click to your headline and come and look at your story. Our next news story here is, let's go back and talk a little bit about SteamOS, because we have a new SteamOS update. SteamOS update 2.164. Now, last week we talked about a new SteamOS version 3 Clockwork that is coming out. This is not that. This is an update to the Brewmaster beta that has been pushed out by Valve that updates the kernel to 4.16. With DC enabled for AMD pre-Vega cards. So for those of you with Radeon pre-Vega cards, that will provide you with a good performance boost. Mesa 18.1.5 with an LLVM of 7.0 it was released for the Mesa driver users, while the Nvidia drivers were updated to 396.45. which is the latest Nvidia driver available. Actually, there's a new .54 release that came out just today, but one of the newest Nvidia drivers. The driver management of SteamOS is a bit laggy. I think this updates it from version 384, so quite a significant driver update there. I do not have a box with a SteamOS installation installed right now. I often do. I've got a Steam machine. I'm going to wait for the Clockwork version 3 to come out and then install that for a run. Maybe I'll do it in a VM. But for those of you guys that are using SteamOS on a console-like system, definitely a worthy update there, if only for the drivers and the kernels. We've also got, I mentioned there, the Nvidia driver update. Nvidia released 396.51 which is just available for release yesterday. And the the Windows versions, I believe, are at 398 dot something. So we're a little behind on the Linux side, but good to see another update there. I will get that and upgrade a little later on, or actually Intergos here should upgrade it for me in its next refresh. So good ongoing support there. This what does it offer up? It doesn't offer up too much for Linux users, it says, but there's now support for the Vulkan extension of VKEXT, blah, 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 blah. Official support for the Quadro P3200. Doesn't look like a big deal, but it's nice to stay fresh. What else do we have? We've got DXVK 0.64 released with more game fixes. DXVK is the compatibility layer for DX11. So for Direct3D11 games, it allows a translation between Direct3D11 or DirectX11 calls into Vulkan, which allows you to play an incredibly robust number of Windows games in Linux. DXVK 0.64 now supports a number of new functionalities, including support for D3D11.1 resource discard functionality, fixed some errors, updated MSAA sample locations. Anyway, some fixes for Dragon Ball, Final Fantasy 15. Well, actually, that's a good one. Final Fantasy 15 added workaround for broken compute shader barriers on RADV. That would be significant. That's a very recent game. Hellblade fixes, Hitman fixes, World of Warship fixes, and so forth. If you're using Lutris, just basically go into your configure box for the game that you're looking for and replace 0.63 or 54 or whatever you're using with 0.64, and it will automatically update it for you. Finally, we've got an update from Purism. Purism is developing an open source Linux-based phone, cell phone, smartphone, and they provided an update on their software and hardware efforts. They say that they have continued work on their calls and messaging apps, and then they actually have some pictures in there of kind of early views of what they're going to look like. Apparently they have the Ethernet working for their developer kit as well as the secondary SD card port. They're struggling apparently here and there, but making some very good progress. Now, one of the good news, one of the good points here, and look, I appreciate their, how open they are and how transparent they are with their releases. I am a supporter. I've pre-ordered the phone and I'm waiting for it. For whatever reason, again, I don't really know the inner politics of the Linux community, but it seems to me like the Linux podcast guys that I listen to are highly skeptical and cynical of this project. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that on our Focus On topic, which is toxicity in the Linux community. But there is a lot of negativity towards the project in terms of their ability to meet their objectives, and that may come from the failure of the canonical version of the Ubuntu phone, which was eventually scratched. Maybe there's some sour grapes over there. I don't know. What I do know is that I've pre-ordered it, and I am hopeful, and I'm waiting for these guys to take their time and get their act together and then ship a phone that is a good test case for what we can do with the Linux kernel and Linux software on a smartphone layer. They did indicate that they are trying for a January 2019 launch, but it looks doubtful according to these guys here on Phoronix. I could care less whether it ships in January or February. Let's just give them time to get their work done. But I'm optimistic. I don't appreciate the negativity that so many people in the Linux community have towards purism, and I wish them all the best. I appreciate their transparency. I appreciate their updates, and I appreciate their visibility on both challenges and successes that they've had. So that's that for now. Why don't we come back in 10 seconds and let's talk about what we've been tweeting. Thanks for sticking with us here on Mostly Gaming. This week, rather than looking at what we've been tweeting, let's look at Reddit. We posted up, there is a new, let me just kind of by way of background, there is a new streaming service called Shadow. You can find it at shadow.tech, T-E-C-H, shadow.tech. This is a service that effectively allows you to rent a computer to play games that you already own. So if you've got a Steam library, if you've got a GOG library or an Origin or Epic or whatever you have, you effectively can rent a pretty powerful high-end PC with a dedicated GPU, you know, similar to a 1080 Ti. And rather than basically playing your games locally, you can stream your games over an internet connection. Wi-Fi is workable. Ethernet obviously is better. And we've talked quite a bit about streaming. There seems to be, you know, this is not a new concept. We've seen this many times beginning, I believe the first time I remember hearing about it was the Phantom, which was a little ahead of its time. But, you know, there are an increasing number of companies and organizations that are basically looking to streaming down the road. Xbox, we talked about. Microsoft maybe planning to release an Xbox, a streaming version of the Xbox next generation console, where you will stream the games on some dedicated local device that they provide. Nvidia offers Nvidia Now, which is similar to this service. PlayStation Now is another service that is run by Sony. So we're seeing more and more of these services launch as the technology for streaming improves and bandwidth speeds increase. The reason I'm talking about this one is because they have a little Tux Penguin on their site, which makes me optimistic that they will be supporting Linux with a native Linux client for streaming your games. Now, the interesting thing is here, you know, if you're looking at the screen, they've got an Apple logo, a Windows logo, an Android logo, the Linux Tux logo, and iOS soon. But they do not have the word Linux anywhere on their site. So I reached out to them to see if they are indeed supporting Linux with the Linux Tux logo there. I have not heard back from them. I am assuming that this can only be a Linux Tux operating system support for their Shadow apps. And if that is the case, I think this is very good news for Linux gaming. And let me just kind of, before I go into the discussion, let me just go a little bit more into, this is a review from Polygon of specifically the Shadow service. This is a French startup named Blade. I'm just going to read here from the Polygon article. It's putting a bigger bet on that possibility than most others. Blade soft launched its cloud gaming service Shadow in California in the past February, following a successful debut in Europe in late 2016. Now, Blade is taking Shadow to the masses in America. But as tough as the platform's technological hurdles are, Blade realizes it has an even more daunting task, simply getting people on board. How Shadow works. The idea behind Shadow is paying for streaming access to a powerful cloud-based gaming PC that would cost approximately $2,000 to build. Of course, that would just be the initial outlay. As time went by and the machine aged, you might be inclined to spend more to upgrade key parts like the graphics card. Part of Shadow's appeal is that Blade will handle all of that for you. The company promises to periodically swap out components for newer ones, always keeping the PC up to date so it can run the latest games on max settings. Shadow's Nvidia-based graphics solution is approximately equivalent to a GeForce GTX 1080, with 16 gigabytes of video memory, twice as much as the amount in a consumer-grade GTX 1080, and Blade is now upgrading its Intel Xeon CPU to a newer model that delivers 30% more performance. Apparently, they are targeting 60 frames per second in regular streaming, but they're also looking to eventually add 4K 60 streaming. As I said, you will play with your own games on your own service, and you do not need to rent games. You can just buy them on Steam or Origin or whatever you have. You are just basically effectively renting the hardware. Let me take a look here at the video so you guys can get a better sense of what it is. All right, so there it is. It looks very promising. The cost is $35 a month, US. Which isn't bad. I mean, $35 a month for renting effectively a $2,000 PC is, you know, if you kind of pay it annually, it's about $350 a year. You know, so you're talking about 5 years worth of computing, you know, for a $2,000 box. Maybe, you know, more or less about five to 6 years, which is fantastic. You know, I think that's actually a very good value, because your machine will always stay current and you don't have to worry about updating or upgrading. Now, this presumes that maybe you're going to replace your existing PC. You know, if I was to use it, I would probably keep my existing PC and use that as a supplemental machine. So that's what it is. And so I posted this. Again, I was very excited by the fact that this appears to support Linux. And one of the key challenges that we have with people coming over to Weakness is, of course, their ability to play their game library, you know, which many games are not available on Linux. And, you know, you can fiddle with Wine or virtual machines or dual booting or whatever. It's just it's a pain. But if you can stream, does that eliminate that barrier? And that was the topic of discussion that I posted here on the Linux gaming subreddit. I posted a picture of the Tux Bucks, and I basically posted that the service is shadow.tech, and it's basically a GPU rental via streaming. It's a bit pricey. That was my initial view. It's a bit pricey at $35 per month, but it gets you the equivalent of a dedicated 1080 Ti on whatever device you want to play on. Again, not quite accurate. It looks like it's kind of somewhere between a 1080 and a 1080 Ti based on the specs that I just read. It appears to have a Linux client available. Under the right pricing and circumstances, I can see a situation where Linux users can eventually go with a service like this and ditch dual booting, VMs, and Wine completely. The first response here from Z220 is, I'd rather die before paying someone a monthly fee to run Windows 10 for me so I can stream Windows-only games. Touche. It's not for everybody, hey, but don't be toxic. You know, just because it's not for you doesn't mean it's not for somebody else, and more choice is better. I don't think he was being toxic, to be fair. Briel posted my quote about it's a bit pricey at $35 per month. Breel says, I think that's really cheap. For that little money, you can pretty much game on the go if you want to. Not with light games, with the heaviest ones. I have no particular interest in gaming on the go, but looking at how many DSs sold, a lot of people do. That could also allow people to game on x86 desktop computers or notebooks, or simply for a one-time cost of $35, you might be able to play the one game you really want, but that your system won't allow you to. He says, I've spent more money on RPCS3's Patreon to play 2 games, and yet they're still unplayable. Good point. That actually changed my mind. The $35 a month, I do not believe is expensive. UOU says, I agree. Gut reaction is to compare that $35 to what you spend on games per month, in which case for many gamers will seem a lot. But if you factor in the cost of a gaming PC console plus the subscription console gamers pay to play online, it becomes more reasonable. And it'll probably get cheaper as it scales. And when anything that can play a video stream can be a gaming machine, then alongside phones and tablets, you could game on a Raspberry Pi. TVs could even have the capability built in. He says, I don't like the idea, but putting ethics and the health of gaming and all that aside, from a purely consumer perspective, there are a lot of advantages. He makes a good point there about the ethics. I'll come back to that in a minute. My response to that was, you know what? You changed my mind and I agree. UOU then comes back with some more thoughts. He says, it's certainly true that if this kind of thing becomes the norm, that it puts Linux on an even footing with any other platform in terms of gaming, anything that can play a video stream basically. But I think a common sentiment amongst Linux users, part of the culture really, is a distrust of cloud and a desire to have things be local. Doesn't apply to everyone, of course, but one of the reasons most of us use Linux is that we want to control our own stuff. It's not true in all cases. Most people seem okay with Spotify and Netflix, for example. I think that it's because music and video are seen as ephemeral, transient, and kind of disposable. But okay, so why? Let me just kind of make the argument a little bit later. I'm not sure we see gaming like that yet. And then he goes on to basically say, if I gamed via such a service, the PC in front of me, rather than being an i7 with a GTX 1070, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and a big SSD and HDD, would probably be something like an i3 integrated GPU. He goes on to basically make the argument that this may not be good for Nvidia and other GPU makers because it will lead to lower sales of GPUs if he can just basically run one. My response to that is interesting points, because Nvidia is offering a similar service with no Linux support. This service and the Nvidia one are interesting because they allow you to play your existing games that you purchase via Steam or GOG or whatever on the rented GPU. You can own your game to the extent that games are owned these days anyway, which they're not because you're licensing your games, and store them locally if you want to play them in their true glory occasionally via something like this, which will be updated as new GPU technology is launched. In terms of whether it's bad for Nvidia or AMD selling fewer GPUs, etc., that's an interesting point, but given that Nvidia is launching a similar service and the stock prices of both are at all-time highs, it seems that the market is very enthusiastic about the prospects of both. Breely then responds to that with the issue with respect to the decline in GPU gaming if a service like this was released. And he says that farms need to be close to, by for decent latency, so I'm not sure they'll be able to get to 95% fewer GPUs. Also, even if average playtime is about 8 hours, I'd assume by time zone. So basically what he's saying is you're going to need a lot of these server farms. Which then kind of leads into a debate about whether you know, renting GPUs will lead to a decline in GPU sales. And the point that is made here is that if there are huge efficiency savings as I'm pretty sure there would be then. All else being equal, Nvidia et al. Would just charge more per card, but that's a very different way of doing business to what they do now. The economic pressures could change. Gamers pretty much want as much power as possible at any cost. A server farm operator would care more about power efficiency and palatalization, so it's entirely possible that GPUs would go in that direction, stop getting faster and become more power efficient and parallelizable, potentially even opening up to the field to other companies who are better at it. And then we kind of continue on in a wonderful debate, non-toxic in nature, right there on Linux Gaming. You can go and take a look at the debate yourself if you want to kind of take a look at it. It's on Linux_gaming on Reddit. My view is, and it has been, and you know what, I'm open to counter arguments as well, but generally, you know, the less I have to launch into another operating system on my existing local machine to game, you know, like Windows, and the more I can just basically use my operating system of choice, which is Linux, to do everything that I can, and then every once in a while to basically stream, it makes my system more usable and me a happier user. And I think as you remove barriers to Linux, you improve the Linux experience, and improving the Linux experience is, all else being equal, a better thing. Will it be good for gaming? I don't know yet. I think there's some good points here. You know, the whole trend to stuff as a service has its pluses and minuses, right? I mean, you know, everybody wants you to basically pay a monthly fee these days, and GPUs or PCs as a service is effectively what this is. But, you know, if the economics work, maybe it is better. You know, $35 a month. You know, if it's a $2,000 PC, that is 5 to 6 years of computing. And the regular depreciation rate of a PC is probably, of a gaming PC, is probably 3 to 4 years, right? And you know, declining over time. So, you know, assuming you can get the bandwidth capacity to have a good lag-free experience, my gut feel is this is a better deal. This is a better deal than having a gaming PC. It's not available in Canada, so I'm not in a position to use it or try it, but it is certainly something that I have been keeping up to speed with, the general trend to streaming. And I'm wary of moral hazard, which is a situation in which the incentives for the people selling us stuff are not aligned with the incentives of us buying the stuff, you know, which I see as an issue in game rentals. When you're renting a game rather than buying a game, I see that as being an issue, and I talked about that last week. I don't see that here in this particular service in any case, and I see it as a very big plus to finally see somebody supporting a Linux app for their game streaming service. So that's on Linux_gaming. Go take a look, have a post, have a chat, let us know what you think. We'll be back in 10 seconds with our Discovery Queue. We're back with the new games this week on our Discovery Queue. Rather than going through the queue this week, which has been a little kind of spotty in terms of the algorithms that Steam seems to use for generating the Discovery Queue for new games, let's just focus on a couple of the big games that are available this week. One is Star Traders Frontiers. Star Traders Frontiers gets a full release. This has been an early access game for some time, and August 1st it launched as a full release. I typically do not like to buy games in early access, so I have not bought this yet, but The description says, command your ship and crew as a space pirate, merchant, bounty hunter, and more, while taking total control of your destiny as you venture through a massive open universe. Choose your path in a constantly evolving galaxy torn by internal strife, as well as political intrigue and alien threats. You have a ship that you can customize with more than 300 upgrades. Journey across an endless, procedurally generated galaxy. Kind of sounds a little bit like that other No Man's Sky kind of idea. Maybe, maybe not. Let's take a look at the trailer and see if it's worthy of a wish list. All right, that looks interesting. You know, graphic wise, it's kind of cartoony, little cell shading. Let's take a look at it on Steam. You know, it looks good, but it just looks not that great in terms of the graphics, and maybe I'm being a little shallow. Oh, it's only a $14 game. I mean, forget that. Okay, that's a buy. I will buy this game. It looks interesting. I like the aspirational components of it. It's $14, Linux native. Done. You've sold another one. I'll take it out for a spin, and we'll talk about it next week. The other game, there's 3 ones that we want to talk about this week. The next one is Beast of Winter, which is the first Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire paid DLC. I've already bought this because I've bought whatever the edition is that basically gives you all the DLC. Still a little frustrated with this game for not having a workable cloud save. Is it just me? Because when I launch it, it gives me a cloud save error. But my cloud services are on, and it does not work. It doesn't work on Arch, it doesn't work on Ubuntu, it doesn't work on the various different distributions that I tried. I don't know if cloud save works. I can't get it to work, and it's very frustrating. In any case, Beast of Winter is out. I have not tried it, but let's give it a run here and see what Obsidian's got in store for us.
We have unfinished business, you and I. My realm is the gaping maw of entropy. The hunger that cannot be sated. Each time she escapes, each time I drag her back, the tear widens. The world will end in stillness and in cold. It is inevitable.
Wow, that looks very impressive. Okay, so I mean, I've already got that, so that's definitely a must play. The big complaint that I have is I lost another cloud save because I decided to switch over my XPS 13 from an Ubuntu budgie build distro to Antergos. I wanted to go all Antergos all the time, and I copied over the wrong, apparently, save folder. So that's the second time that I've lost it. Interestingly enough, okay, in the save folder that is installed, when I install the game, there are save files in there, and from an earlier game. So I will go back to my first playthrough, which was never finished because I lost it, and continue that one. But the save files are there somewhere in the cloud. They're just not accessible when I launch the game, and maybe I'm doing something wrong. If I am, I'm an idiot. But it is very frustrating. So I do want to eventually get through and play this game. The third game that we have on our list is a game called Forsaken Remastered. And let me launch it over here. Forsaken Remastered is... I don't know this game. I don't know this game, and I've never heard of it. I found out about it through Iculus, which is a fella that basically does a lot of work with developers porting over their games to Linux, and he basically does it for free. He did the Turok and the Turok 2 ports recently. He's got a Patreon account that I support as well. And basically, you can go to Patreon at Iculus, ICCULUS on Twitter. Look him up, and toss him a few bucks a month if you want to support more games on Linux. And he basically approaches publishers and offers to port their games over to Linux for free, and we, the Linux community, pay him for it through his Patreon. It's a brilliant open source solution. One of the things I love about Linux. So Forsaken Remastered is, let me just read from the description here. Scavengers from all over the galaxy have come to a dead Earth, but the remains of the technology that can be found. Hold on a second. It's Steam, you really got to improve your Linux or your just your Steam client. You cannot. I mean, just the DPI is too small for me to be able to read the text on it at 4K, and there's no obvious way for me to increase the text. And it's just a web browser, but pressing Control Plus doesn't work. So let me just get closer so that I can read it with my aging eyes. Scavengers from all over the galaxy have come to a dead Earth to loot the remains of the technology that can be found in underground tunnels. You must fight your way past the scum of the universe. As you prepare for deadly combat, you are going to quickly learn that the future is forsaken. Looks quite interesting. I'm just trying to figure out what kind of a game is it. Is it like a dungeon crawler? Let's take a look at the trailer. It's a space crawling dungeon crawl shooter. Looks actually very, very good. Forsaken Remastered, available day and date. It was launched for Linux. If you want to support Linux gaming and you want to talk about no tux, no buxing, you know what? When games are released day and date for Linux, you should give them a shot. This game is about $20. A little more pricey than than maybe I would expect for a game like that, considering Star Traders Frontier is only $11. I would probably go for the cheaper game first if I had to choose one or the other. But both are worthy, and I'm going to buy both as well. So those are, that's pretty good stuff for the middle of August, or beginning of August anyway. Certainly no shortage of games to play on Linux. So let's leave it there. I don't want to overdo my discovery queue, and let's come back with a focus on toxicity in the Linux community. And we're back with a focus topic this week is toxicity in Linux. And this topic comes from, there was a recent one of the Jupiter podcasts. I don't know, they all have the same they all seem to be the same to me, and Jupiter has like 3 or 4 or 5 Linux podcasts, and I really can't tell the difference between each. So they all kind of blend. They all have slightly different names, but they're all the same people, it appears to me. And I think they're very, very well done, professionally done, kind of Linux focused podcasts. Highly recommended. I think there's Linux Action News, there's Linux Unplugged, there's a bunch of them that you can basically search if you're not familiar with them, or just search for Jupiter Broadcasting. You can find them, I'm sure, on Twitter, Jupiter Broadcasting. There it is. I'm following them right now. Their Twitter handle is @JupiterSignal. Home to the best shows on Linux: open source, security, privacy, community, development news, and politics. So in one of their shows, they talked about how toxic the Linux community could be, in particular the Linux or the r/Linux sub on Reddit. It was kind of an interesting discussion, because they were essentially, their view was that the high level of toxicity on that subreddit scares new Linux users away and is bad for the community. And in fact, they kind of came right out and said, you know what, we contribute to that toxicity on that subreddit, and it almost cannot be helped, which I found odd. I mean, you can certainly help it. If you are toxic, just stop. But the bigger point that I kind of considered on that was, I don't find that subreddit to be overly toxic. I mean, certainly there are toxic components, and certainly I can be toxic. Like, everybody can be a prick on the internet, okay? I don't think there is anybody that is completely pure on that front. We can all try better, but there are better and worse situations. So, if you want to see toxicity, go jump into a subreddit on politics, or the Donald, or anything having to do with environmentalism and that kind of stuff on that side. Social justice warriors everywhere. Reddit is a is a very left-leaning community. And so if you have a view that is basically out of the standard left-wing viewpoint, you're going to get attacked 10 to 1, okay, by people. And realistically, there's no point getting into a debate, because nobody is looking to be convinced. They're looking to repeat the things they've heard somewhere else. But I'm certainly not. I'm certainly prone to that myself, and I've gotten into debates with the crazies out there, and I probably can dish it out as well as I can take it. Recently I got into kind of an ongoing back and forth in Canadian politics about there's a debate here about global warming, climate change, and carbon taxes and so forth. And I won't get into that political debate here, but I was probably for Linux, sorry, not for Linux, for Reddit, I was the minority view that carbon taxes will do nothing but make us poorer. Not one person basically came to support me, because there's probably nobody out there that supports that view on subreddit, or if they are, they're few and far between. And so, for every kind of post that I would make, there's 10 posts that come out negative, some more knowledgeable than others, and some very toxic. Now, if you are a regular user of the internet, you're used to the toxicity, and maybe that is a bad thing because we have become immune to it. At least I have. But, given by the general standard out there, I would say the Linux community is probably a little bit better. But, that is not a high standard, because, Twitter and Facebook, I mean, so many of these things are increasingly toxic these days, largely driven by the wedge in global politics that has happened really, with the election maybe of Donald Trump, or maybe, the tail end of the Obama administration, for, which to people that oppose Obama was just as kind of, divisive as Trump is to the people that oppose him. And that rift in politics is driving anger and rifts and debates, and really kind of toxic level debates, rather than discussions across many different fields beyond just politics. But what does that mean for Linux gaming? And again, let's just kind of go back to that rather than focus on toxicity in general. And I think where toxicity in the Linux community is often most felt is when people take up the standard view regarding free and open source proprietary software. Certainly, if anybody has support for Windows, you're going to get some toxic responses. But if you are basically a casual user of Linux that just wants to get things done, you can get attacked for speaking out of turn. You have, the crazies out there that will attack you for not already knowing everything, which is unfortunate. And you also have, though, on the other hand, some of the most helpful and supportive people that I have ever run into if you have a problem. And I would say that they kind of more than cancel themselves out in terms of the people that are helpful are far more numerous than the people that are toxic. And I talked about that discussion that I talked about, that they launched up in our Reddit discussion regarding the streaming box. That was a fantastic discussion. You could have pros and cons. You can have ideological issues. So much of that was put aside in that discussion for the sake of having a good discussion that I generally find to be the more common experience that I have on Linux boards. And so I'm not really sure where the toxicity that they're talking to in terms of saying that it is really, really bad comes from. It exists, but is it worse than, say, your average subreddit? I would say absolutely not. But what we can do, though, is try to be a little better every day when we are online. Begin with ourselves, and beginning with myself personally, and try to do a little less trolling. Maybe a little less trolling and a little more talking would make everybody a better human being on and off the internet. We'll be back in 10 seconds with our closing thoughts. Thank you for joining us this week for episode 19 of At Mostly Linux on Mostly Gaming. If you are listening to this on audio, thank you very much for downloading or streaming this, but please do us a favor and subscribe. Our listenership numbers are far greater than our subscribership numbers, and we're not sure what's causing that, but if you listen and you don't subscribe, and you can get it delivered to your podcast player of choice, whether it's Apple or Stitcher or Spotify or Podcatcher or Dogcatcher or whatever you have. We have a link for you. Just search for @mostly_Linux in your podcast player of choice and you will find our feed. But we're also on YouTube if you search for @mostlylinux. We're also on Twitch @mostlylinux. We are on Steam. We have our own group @mostlylinux. We have Twitter @mostlylinux. We are everywhere that you are, so please feel free to come and find us. Subscribe. We're on PeerTube as well. Cannot forget PeerTube @mostly_Linux. Do a search, find us out there, give us a thumbs up, a like, a heart, whatever it may be, a retweet, and hopefully we can continue to get these numbers to grow. Thank you very much for listening. If you are one of those that listen to the very end, hearts and kisses out to you. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week for episode 0.2.